Good afternoon, everyone. Jason McClay from G2G3. Got a bit of a graveyard shift here, so a third session on after lunch. Everybody had a big fat boy lunch. The lights are down. We've got great views of Edinburgh Castle. It's just like Scotland. As soon as the sun starts to shine, let's close the blinds and we'll have a look through. So I've tweaked the agenda a little bit. I've spoke, as Jamie said, at a number of build sessions over the last couple of years. And in line with the agenda this time, with the theme around big data, we've tweaked the sort of the gaming and education to focus a little bit more around the engagement, but I'll touch on some of the game science angle as we go through the session. Just a little bit about us. We're a local company based in Edinburgh, founded back in 2000, and initially we were building simulations, so classroom-based exercises and communicating IT best practices like ITIL, IT service management, progressing into PPM, and more recently security, cloud, and simulations and exercises around big data that are used internally to raise awareness around best practice processes to drive organizational change in large blue chips, used in foundation level education. And a number of the vendors, companies like HP, IBM, and Microsoft, are using our form of simulation in the classroom, internally, and with clients to bring some of the process messages to life. So as we've continued to mature our capability and grow our skill set, that's expanded into what we're calling serious games. So using gaming technology to provide immersive environments. And the cyber market lends itself very well to that because the MO is very similar to the hacker in real life. You've got someone sat at a machine trying to beat a system or to overcome some defense, and you've got defense and attack. So I'll talk a little bit, not too much about us. We'll get into the actual aim of the presentation itself. So it's trying to build on a lot of the great stuff and content that you've heard this morning. So lots of great background, a lot of great energy, huge amount of intellectual property being communicated this morning. You heard about heuristics, math heuristics, meta heuristics. We've a lot about IPS, IDS, a lot of the processes that are used. Our focus is to come in and work in parallel to a lot of organizations, a lot of internal organizations, a lot of vendors, and try and make that message tangible to the audience, whether that's the IT professional or quite often in this environment around cyber, the IT user, because as you're aware, and some of the statistics that we've heard through this morning, very much focused on the threat that the individual IT user can create within your organization that can countermand or undermine some of the protection and defense mechanisms you have in place. So it's really trying to reduce the risk that the IT user can present in your organization. We use a bit of human-centered design, for those who are familiar with that, in terms of the solutions that we build. So it's very much understanding the education, understanding the knowledge transfer, how we're going to engage with the participant in order to craft a compelling solution that brings a message to life for them in order to trigger some behavioral change. That's a little bit of the science that underpins how we work and what we're all about. And it's very much focused on the engagement, so trying to engage an audience to change their behavior, make them aware of the risk. And quite often this is sort of grassroots up, so we're encouraging them to be aware of the impact of their actions and to change their behavior accordingly. It's not top-down, or you're trying to come away from top-down in terms of telling them what to do, because we know 9 times out of 10 people will deliberately, not with any malice or intent, but complete behavior that can be contradictory. So if we just look at some of the areas that we'll focus on, it's traditionally around the education, the communication, and the incident response. So we're trying to bring compelling messages to life in order to try and engage an audience, to educate them, communicate to them about the risk, and or change behavior around incident response. And with the continued growth of sort of big data, some of the risks, some of the threats, there is an opportunity now to be disruptive in terms of how you're engaging your audience. So you'll see lots of changes out there in the workplace, but are we changing as rapidly as effectively to deliver a quality of service in terms of the education that you would expect to see out there in real life? And being disruptive. If we look firstly at the education space, there's a number of problem statements. Now, some of this may apply to your organization, some may not. Obvious problem statement there. In behind this is what mandatory training can look like. So put your hands up if your organization completes or mandates mandatory training. So quite a large number of you know. We were acquired 3 years ago, and we, having gone from a little bit of a special forces type Wild West organization, we're now part of a bigger organization, and we have mandatory training around diversity, legal and finance compliance, and cyber awareness. Now, the obvious challenge here is that we have a 12-month deadline. At the end of the year, we have to have completed our mandatory training. Okay, that's all there is. it is not tied up in any way, shape, or form with any of the activity that's happening in real life. So a lot of the great work that we've heard about people today, whether that's on the process specialists, the technology providers, the specialist practitioners, and quite often in a big organization like ours, we see some challenges that they're completing activity and there's a gap between what they're doing, what they're seeing, the attack types that they're responding to, all the great work that they're doing, and what's actually happening to me, the IT user, at the mandatory training space. And underneath that, we may have some communication that may try and tie the two together, but they're essentially an open loop in terms of what's going on. And it's trying to bridge that loop to create a closed loop system where there's much greater connection between what's happening in the organization, making the individual user aware of that activity and trying to encourage them to be part of the broader team. There's a great book. Has anyone read Matthew Syed's Black Box Thinking? Anyone? So published only last year. He talks a lot about open and closed loop systems. Okay, so, and he would suggest that people are successful, have got a closed loop system in place across a number of different industries or domains where they're taking that feedback and actioning and constantly refining what they do. One of the great examples that he talks about there is the airline industry. If they have a major issue or an incident, they're obviously getting together. The airline will be there, the Civil Aviation Authority, some of the local governments or the local industries or regions that are impacted. And they will try and learn as quickly as they can from that action or that event. Now, they have the black box there, which is obviously giving them the feedback in real time. They can track the issue, the incident, but there is a closed loop. So when something happening, there is some learning in place, and that is then fed back and disseminated as rapidly as possible in order to try and change a behavior or to learn from that issue or that incident. We've talked a little bit about the disconnect in terms of what's happening in the real world back into the mandatory training. Quite often there's a sheep dip approach, okay, where we have a degree of training that's out there that's irrelevant to your role may be in the organization or the degree of risk or exposure. Now, as organizations become increasingly mature and your big data and your analysis and the ability to use and leverage the big data continues to grow, so we see organizations continuing to maybe mature how they're targeting individuals through the behavior analysis in order to try and deliver training that's specific to their risks, their behavior, or their profile. What's the motivation for completing the mandatory training in a lot of organizations? Anyone? Yeah, well, money. Yeah, so well, that's the risk at the high level, top down. So you're trying to quite often drive on fear. So there's a risk to our organization. You must complete the mandatory training or any of the training that you're going through, and or compliance. So your team's not compliant, you haven't gone through the action. It's very much a top-down approach where you're trying to encourage and mandate training without necessarily joining the dots or linking that effectively to what's happening in the real world and some of the, quite frankly, exciting activity that's taking place. And if you look at some of the organizations that can do this particularly well in parallel fields, the forces, for example, this is a shot of HMS Illustrious. If they're in the war room, in the operations room, then the whole organization is working to defeat the attacker or defeat the enemy. In your organization, particularly across big businesses and small, everyone has a role to play, and quite often it's the cyber specialists and security analysts, the practitioners, the technologists who are actually predominantly leading the fight, and then the individual users are quite often left behind with only a cursory level of emphasis. So some of the trends that you're seeing, some of the more progressive organizations are moving towards at the moment, and some of this is happening, some of it's happening further down the line, leveraging some of the big data to use predictive analytics to try and understand the different threat type or vector, what's coming soon, what are we seeing from the enemy forces or the attackers, and then releasing training and communications that are directly in line to what's happening back in the industry. The second one is analyzing patterns of behavior. So some of the clustering analysis, okay, some of the other analysis techniques around network analytics that we can use to try and identify behaviors. Can we identify some of the risks, risk profiles, groups that are conducting themselves in a way that may leave us slightly more exposed, and again, offering up training that's specific to that role or that individual behavior. And that's potentially further down the line for a lot of organizations, but we're certainly seeing some trends and movements to that space. And looking at the industry trends, Eamon and some of the presentations earlier today were talking about forums and seminars and communicating where they're seeing the threat types, some of the profiles, and then be able to react as an organization to deliver just-in-time training that's linked to everything that's going on in the organization. So moving away from that sort of sheep dip Here it is, you've got to do it by the end of the year, to a delivery of education, communication that's a little bit more dynamic and that's a little bit more linked to the threat and the activity that's going on, and trying to ensure that the user or the individual feel very much as if they're part of the fight against the attacker or working to try and reduce risk in their organization. So that's a little bit of some of the trends and the activities we're seeing in the education space, both in the short-term future and the new. Communication's obviously a key element, okay, in support of that can predominantly be a little bit more dynamic. The problem statement from this sense or perspective can be that even in organizations like ours, we're simply getting an email to say that there's been a cyber incident or that there's been some form of attack. And that's very much all we're seeing in a lot of organizations. We're not necessarily joining the dots and sharing as much information as knowledge as can be possible to try and make the user very much aware of what's happening in the organization, where some of the attacks, the vulnerabilities lie, and some of the behaviors that we're seeing in our organization. So it's trying to make that a little bit more contextual for the individual IT user in order to engage them more effectively. And again, it's coming back to the loop. So it's ensuring that there is a closed loop and that the people in your organization, whether it be public or private sector or small, they're getting an idea of what's going on and the risk that they can present, what some of their peers, so they can norm their behavior against some of their peers, and actions that they should be taking in order to try and minimize the risk in our organization. So one example here, as well, is using some of the data and the analytics to visualize this. So if this was the Bank of Edinburgh, for example, there will be a degree of, if you've got 10, 15, 20,000 people in your organization, if that's the headquarter building in white, we may find that there's a number of people who are accessing Wi-Fi hotspots in Costa or Starbucks in the sort of the red dots around the office. Some of the speakers this morning have talked about the risk of losing laptops, mobile phones, leaving them on trains at Haymarket Station. How often is that happening? What risk is that creating to us across the organization or across broader industry? And then the brown dots in the bottom right-hand corner, what are some of the risks or threats or attacks that we're seeing when people are accessing Wi-Fi or services from home if they're not using the VPN? So for some of the organizations that are doing this a little bit more progressively, they're trying to paint a more colorful picture to their organizations. So they're using some of the communications, some of the data analytics, and some common sense to try and bring that message to life. So quite often, the focus can be very much on the IT professional or the cybersecurity team. What we're seeing with some of the more progressive organizations is trying to tell a more effective story, using some of the data and some of the other information that you have in order to make people aware of the threats and risks that they present. Very much, I don't know how many, so sometimes you're standing at 3 o'clock, you're frightened that people may have seen some of the slides before because you've gone on later. How many people have you seen a tiger licking a head so far today? Right, good. It would be a bit embarrassed if someone said, yes, that was on slide 3 on the first presentation. This is all about trust. So in a lot of organizations, a lot of the information is guarded quite jealously, and rightly so. We may not be able to share with our IT users within our organization the degree of threat that we've had, the number of DDoS attacks, the degree of intensity. But it's important that where possible, we can build that trust and share as much information as we can so that people are very much aware of the topic and the cadence of activity and the fact that people are trying to get into your organization every day. There's not a huge degree of consistency, so in organizations like ours, there will be people in my organization across the piece coming up to annual figures being released in the industry are sensitive, and they have access to sensitive information around that can impact the company's share price. So have they hit their profit target? Have they hit their margin? And it's trying to have that degree of consistency. Of course, there's a degree of risk with this information that has to be guarded and managed, but should we be opening up a little bit more internally in our organization to try and ensure that we're very much aware of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in order to try and drive some engagement around the topic. And a quote from Edward Tufte, one of the sort of grandfathers of infographics: above all else, share the data. Where we can, try and engage with our audience to bring that message to life. We talked a little bit about what we're seeing in the education space, a little bit on communication now and in the future, and what some of those organizations are doing here, a little bit more progressive. Incident response, we're not quite so active as an organization. Problem statement can be here. It can look a little bit like that, sort of saucer eyes in organizations whenever there's a major incident kicking off. Now, a lot of you may have third-party CSOCs that are in place. You heard from Stephen Livingston at Lloyd's, obviously particularly mature, but it can be quite high-stressed, high pressure. One of the challenges can be around trying to work out who to identify, so who are the key stakeholders that we need to engage in order to restore the service, not just within the technology team, across the broader business and some of our other sponsors. So it's trying to understand who the go-to people are there. And from that perspective, harnessing the data and the knowledge in your organization. So we've come across companies like StarMind, who are sort of tearing it up in terms of trying to provide companies access to harness some of the information, the key stakeholders, the key decision makers, the key specialists, and when we're trying to restore service in cyber incidents in particular. Baracta, another organization working in the business analytics space, they're a sister company of ours from a transparency perspective. And again, they're working to try and ensure and support. We're harvesting some of the data and the business intelligence we have in order to respond as effectively and dynamically as we can to any form of attack. Are we using crowdsourcing? Okay. Is it possible? Do we have the technologies and the systems in place in our organization in order to try and be able to harness some of that energy? And what are we doing post the activity? So in terms of the sort of the stunned, shocked silence after having recovered from an incident, you've heard some people talking earlier today about maturing their processes in the event of attack or of issue. How are you as an organization, how are we seeing some organizations reviewing those processes and ensuring either from the data and the analytics or from the process and the activity that we're taking some learning from that? So quite a lot going on in the incident response side. You've heard from some of the technology vendors and the process specialists, but from a big data perspective, there's a number of tools and techniques that are out there that are supporting people taking this forward. Are organizations applying, some of the more progressive ones are applying the same degree of openness and transparency in terms of the innovation. So you'll be running innovation sessions to address a number of business challenges, and increasingly we're seeing organizations trying to adopt the same approach within their organization in the form of jams, trying to celebrate and reward some progression. And what we're also seeing, there's a nice handsome picture of our CTO, Glenn Exton, working with organizations to try and leverage some gamification techniques and methodologies and platforms in order to try and respond effectively to incidents. Simulations are another topic that's been covered off today and this morning. So how can we be using simulation, not necessarily real-time data, but analogous data on completion of attack to rerun and mature how we've responded? So can we replay in short order after an attack, how that attack has unfolded, some of the decisions that we've taken, and then in order to try and replay that, having to change some of the processes, some of the roles, and some of the responsibilities. But it's very much about disrupting the status quo. So there's a lot of emphasis put on the technology, the processes from an IT specialist and a cyber specialist perspective. What we're seeing increasingly is organizations trying to focus on the IT user and some of the threats and risks that they present in terms of the communication, the education. You're seeing organizations investing and trying to collaborate by creating cyber days, building cyber teams across the organization, and then running that through into the operations. I'm conscious of time, so by way of summary, we've talked about some of the challenges in the education market. So it can be static, it can be mandatory, and there's an opportunity where organizations are increasingly maturing and understanding their threat profile and be able to react dynamically, that they're delivering a just-in-time training solution that's bringing that to life and adding a lot of context for the individual and trying to engage the IT user. The communication, it's important that you can share where possible with our internal audience everything that's going on in order to try and bring that message to life and reinforce the role that they have within their organization. Because this is quite, having worked in topics like IT service management, cloud, and project management, cyber is a pretty exciting topic and sexy in many respects. It's in the news every day. It has a lot of relevance, and it's important that within an organization we're able to share as much as we can to embrace and try and build and foster a team approach to how we're fighting the threat. And then on the incident response, there again, a number of challenges. Big data helping some organizations to identify where the skill sets exist and able to support the analysis of the incident as we run that back and continue to build some learning. So a number of challenges across communication, education, and then into the incident response. And we're seeing a number of organizations who are a little bit more progressive, trying to grapple with those and deliver just-in-time solutions that are contextual and try to bring that message to life across their organization. Okay.
Does anyone have any questions for Jason?
How
Yeah, I'm conscious we're being live on TV here somewhere, and I may be, I don't want to contradict my parent organization. We've experienced it firsthand. We're part of a big organization now, having been 25 strong. We're now part of an organization that's 85,000. And we've got to go through a tick box exercise, and it's done to you, I think quite often is the phrase, so I've got to go through my mandatory training, and it's something that has to be endured. That's not to say that in organizations, we're seeing the ones that are more progressive, trying to make it a little bit more contextual, whether that's simply messages even from the CEO at the start of the session to say, listen, this is important to us as an organization, or even the CISO who's trying to communicate the need and the reason why. So some of you will be familiar with Simon Sinek. You know, he talks a lot about leadership, and he talks about his golden circles with the why at the center, and that's absolutely vital. There will be some things that we have to do which are sheep dip, that just to confirm from a compliance perspective, we've all gone through a module. I think you've got to try and engage an audience and tell a story up front so that people are understanding that this is something that's crucial to them and their organization, and they have to invest the company's time, their time, in order to create it. We've seen a couple of organizations who have built modules that they're delivering at different times, whether it's through the quarters, subject to what they're seeing trending, and some of you may already been doing that. So I know that that's there. We're not quite at a stage where it's as dynamic, you know, as it could be, taking feeds from data, from industry, from different sources. But I think coming back to the original question, that whole reason why and communicating the reason why, and if you can see that you're taking the time and energy to invest in the task that you're asking people to buy into, then quite often that can resonate as well. If it's poorly presented and it's quite clearly just checking a box, then that you put in what you get in what you put out. Get in what you put out, you get out what you put in.
I'm going to ask you a hard one. We do a lot of work, obviously, with the likes of Scottish Government and police, and their challenge is trying to make communities and people outside of organisations safe online. Now, there is no mandatory there. You know, you're trying to educate people, but there's no business that's saying you must do this because we have to be compliant. What's their why? How would you get them to engage?
Yeah, it's we're speaking to some of those organisations at the minute, Jamie. I think the view is to try and make it compelling. You know, so one of the previous presentations we've had here, we've been trying to use game science and some gaming that people voluntarily commit a lot of time to. So a number of people here will play Candy Crush Saga, and they will commit huge amount of time in World of Warcraft. So you're trying to make it engaging so that maybe a degree of competition. So you're bringing out some gamification and some game science. So if there's a little bit of a competitive leaderboard there, it may create some sort of bragging rights or water cooler discussion. So I think that's important, that you're trying to make it engaging. I think the reason why is important, so it's all about, and Eamon talked about it just before, that the risk that you create in your own personal life. So Eamon was asking earlier about Facebook, who's got LinkedIn. One of the previous sessions that we had here, we were chatting about people having Hotmail accounts, and a lot of that data is in Romania, and they've got different laws with regards to privacy and who can access some of the data and the content. So I think it's important that you're helping tell a story in terms of the risk that people are exposed to, and they should be aware of that, because there are a lot of us that have been through data loss and cybercrime to a degree. But it is a challenge when it's not within an organization.
Well, thanks, Keith.
Okay, thank you.